I didn't know that game actually had a name. So everybody's gonna need to stand up and get together in groups of 4. 3, you guys have 3. So if you play together. Alright, 3 or 4, whatever. We'll figure it out. So essentially this game is we're just gonna ask each other a bunch of questions, but listen first. We're gonna ask each other a bunch of questions and get to know one another and talk it out and blast off into friendship. That's really cheesy. Purposefully. Did you come up with this game?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Cheesy is my.
It's like uncomfortable just reading that too. But anyway, all right. First question. If you were given a spaceship, great theme.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you.
What would you name it? That's kind of funny because Richard Branson last Sunday was like the first civilian to ever go into space.
Right.
That's pretty funny. Anyways, all right.
It's relevant.
All right. Go ahead. Ask a question. If you were given a spaceship, what would you name it?
Here's our group.
You have to talk though.
Also, introduce yourself first if you don't know the people you're talking to.
Hey, I'm Diego.
No more forget I said maybe Jaws. Solid man. Solid man. I think never come as you don't know. Come on, make yourself. My spaceship. How dare you call me?
What's your name here? Gooey Stewie?
Hey.
Whatever you want.
Numbers and symbols inside of it.
I have no idea what that's from. Okay.
I don't understand. Shalom is the Hebrew word for peace. So it'd be like I'm bringing peace into the universe.
You've been off-roading before?
Yeah. Alright. Joey's wounded, so I'm going to take over. Alright, so you need a new group, and you need to make sure none of the people that were in your first group are in your second group, and it's a group of 3 people. So find a new group, preferably people you don't already know.
Okay, thank you.
You guys were the same.
Alright.
Actually, have your
You turn around there, you turn around there, boom. You can be in a bigger group, it's fine. Alright. Okay.
Are you wearing a red nose?
Next question is this. You can choose 4 people on Earth to be your partners in space. Who will you bring?
Tom Brady, Jerry Rice,
Space Jam all the time. Wait, that's a movie.
Peyton Manning,
He's a great movie.
and
We were like
Slick, I guess.
I have 4 other people.
I'm a Broncos.
I'm taking
So we have this guy.
Yeah, you never been
That's a fact. That's a fact.
Okay, make sure that you introduced yourself to the people in your group so that you actually know each other and you're making new friends. Alright, you need a new group of 3-ish people. You can talk to people who are not your same gender. It is okay.
Okay.
I'll be with you guys.
They're boys though! They can't talk to boys!
Next one.
I don't say no!
I can't talk to boys until I graduate high school.
That's not very nice, Dexter.
Alright, new question is...
Okay, you guys.
New question is... You are forced to live on a different planet with one cartoon character. Who do you choose?
Bugs Bunny. because it's a different planet and then there's Space Jam, and he's a character from Space Jam. So like that was like the first person that came to mind, Bugs Bunny. I guess. No, well, you've got a point. I mean, it's like half and half.
Marvin the Martian. That's smart. You already know how to live on a different planet.
Luke, where are you going with?
Come home. That's the first person who came to mind.
Who? Oh dear.
Oh, the Clone Wars is
That's like before my time.
If there was a planet that had Peyton Manning on it, that's the only planet I'd go to. Because I would.
I was thinking of Bunny from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. No?
All right.
Okay, grab a seat.
That was the game.
That was the whole thing. Hopefully you met somebody new. If you did, afterwards, before you leave, say, good to meet you, such and such, but actually say their name, because such and such should be awkward. All right, now we get some announcements.
We're all kind of wondering.
I just met her today.
Okay, so announcements. The first announcement that we have is about the Thursday morning Bible study that is still going on. It is in here, B3 at 10:30 for an hour every Thursday. Mark Hughes, Brandon, and Mrs. Hughes are leading it. Raise your hand if you've gone. Yeah, how was it? Pretty good? Yeah, so you can see these guys there, maybe this Thursday. Next announcement, we have a night of worship in here tomorrow night at 7 p.m. What time? 7 p.m. We also have a big event coming up next week. I'm not sure what the name of it is. Who knows what it is next Sunday, I think? Oh, yeah, Hume Lake. Hume Lake. Hume Lake is finally here next week. So raise your hand if you're going. not raise the roof with that yet. Okay. Accumulate next week, get stoked, and prepare your hearts and minds for what is to be brought. And we have a beach night tonight with the whole church at T Street at 6 p.m. There's going to be fire, but bring your own activities and meals probably. There's also a really big ocean to swim in. All right, that's it. Thank you. I think I should do stand-up.
All right, so last week we started a new series. In this series, we are going through a book of the Bible that it's very likely not even one of you was familiar with before. Am I accurate in that? Anybody studied the book of Judges before last Sunday? You did? Well done. One person. So, that's exciting because it means that we are delving into books of the Bible and areas of the Bible that previously were unexplored by you. So last week, we talked about kind of the pattern of the book of Judges. We talked about the first two judges that are mentioned in the book of Judges. And then we talked about the fact that each week we're going to go a little further into the book. This week I wanted to start out with a little video. Gives us a really great overview of the book as a whole and kind of takes little chunks, and then we'll dive deeper into one chunk today. But here is that video.
The book of Judges. So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant with God by obeying the commands of the Torah. And if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes were all governed by these judges. Now, don't think of a courtroom. These were regional political military leaders, more like a tribal chieftain. And you need to be warned, the book of Judges is very disturbing and violent. It tells the tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, of its bad leadership, and basically how they become no different than the Canaanites. But this sad story is also meant to generate hope for the future. And you can see this in how the book's designed. There's a large introduction that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. Then the large main section of the book has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges. And the progression here shows how Israel's leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad to worse. The concluding section is really disturbing and shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So let's dive in and we can explore each part a bit more. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. Chapter 2 describes how Israel just moved in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. This part of Israel's history, the narrator says, was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. This cycle provides the literary design and flow for the next main section of the book. It gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges whose stories are told here. Now, the stories of the first 3 judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judge themselves or people who help the judge, they defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer, and they focus in on the character flaws of the judges, which get increasingly worse. So Gideon, he begins pretty well. He's a coward of a man, but he eventually comes to trust that God can save Israel through him. And so he defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying torches and clay pots. But Gideon has a nasty temper, and he murders a bunch of fellow Israelites for not helping him in his battle. And then it all goes downhill from there. He makes an idol from the gold that he won in his battles. And then after he dies, all Israel worships the idol as a god, and the cycle begins again. The next main judge is Jephthah, who's something of a mafia thug living up in the hills. And when things get really bad for Israel, the elders come to him begging for his help. And Jephthah was a very effective leader. He won lots of battles against the Ammonites, but he was so unfamiliar with the God of Israel, he treats him like a Canaanite god. He vows to sacrifice his daughter if he wins the battle. This tragic story, it shows just how far Israel has fallen. They no longer know the character of their own God, which leads to murder and to false worship. The last judge, Samson, is by far the worst. His life began full of promise, but he has no regard for the God of Israel. He was promiscuous, violent, and arrogant. He did win brutally strategic victories over the Philistines, but only at the expense of his own integrity, and his life ends in a violent rush of mass murder. Now, a quick note here. You'll notice a repeated theme in the main section of the book, that at key moments, God's Spirit will empower each of these judges to accomplish these great acts of deliverance. Now, the fact that God uses these really screwed up people doesn't mean he endorses all or even any of their decisions. God is committed first and foremost to saving his people, but all he has to work with is these corrupt leaders. And so work with them he does. This whole section is designed to show just how bad things have gotten. You can't even tell the Israelites and the Canaanites apart anymore, and that's just the leaders. The final section shows Israel as a whole hitting bottom. There are 2 tragic stories here, and they are not for the faint of heart. They're structured by this key line that gets repeated 4 times at the close of the book. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The first story is about an Israelite named Micah who builds a private temple to an idol, and that gets plundered by a private army sent from the tribe of Dan. So they come and they steal everything, and then they go and burn down the peaceful city of Laish and murder all of its inhabitants. It's a horrifying story. When Israel forgets its God, might makes right. The final story of the book is even worse. It's a shocking tale of sexual abuse and violence, which all leads to Israel's first civil war. It's very disturbing. And that's the point. These stories are meant to serve as a warning. Israel's descent into self-destruction is a result of turning away from the God who loves them and saved them out of slavery in Egypt. And now Israel needs to be delivered again from themselves. The only glimmer of hope in this story is found in this repeated line in the last part of the book. It actually forms the last sentence of the story. Israel has no king. And so the stage is set for the following books to tell the origins of King David's family, the book of Ruth, and also the origins of kingship itself in Israel, the book of 1 Samuel. But the story of Judges has value as a tragedy. It's a sobering explanation of the human condition, and ultimately it points out the need for God's grace to send a king who will rescue his people. And that's the book of Judges.
All right, so that gives you kind of an overview, an idea of what the book as a whole is all about and where we're headed. We covered the first 2 last week. Anyone remember what Ehud's big moment was? Yeah, stabbing a gigantic fat dude in the belly so hard that his sword went all the way in up to his forearm and he couldn't pull it out, so he just left it there. And then sliding himself down the poop chute to get away. Yeah, awesome moment for him. After those two judges had lived and died and rescued Israel from oppression, and Israel came into a time of peace again, once again, Israel just was like, oh, good. We're healthy, we're happy, everything's fine. Now we can do whatever we want. So we pick it up again in Judges chapter 4, starting in verse 1. And it says, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots. Sisera, not the Lord, had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Now, one thing I want to point out real quick is the timelines that we're dealing with here are not days or weeks long. It would seem like if a king or a ruler came and started oppressing us and made us slaves, taxed the heck out of us so that we were always poor and scraping by, it would not take 20 years for us to finally go, God save us, right? I mean, that is a long time. How old are you going to be in 20 years? Kylie? 37. Good job. Math. That took a long time, by the way.
Yeah.
37. That's a long time from now to be like, okay, fine. I guess we'll stop worshiping idols and sacrificing children. So it's crazy to me that these cycles are such long periods of time, but to change an entire culture takes time. And so the people would come back to God, they'd say, oh, thanks God, you rescued us. And then they would pretty quickly slip right back into cycles of sin. And then it would take a long time of being oppressed and crushed and kept down until finally they'd say, all right, this sucks a lot. I give up, I quit. God, please save us again, and we'll do what's right again. So, same chapter, next verse says, now Deborah, a prophetess. What's a prophet or a prophetess? Anyone know? Nobody knows. A prophet is a prophet? Wow. Great definition. Yeah.
Someone that talks to God and then tells everyone else what God's saying.
Exactly. So back in the day, before we had the Bible, God would just talk to one person usually at a time. He would say, this is the person I'm going to talk to. They're going to tell everyone else what I say. Don't know why God chose to do it that way. He could have just created a flat screen, above the whole thing and wrote out what he wanted to say. But he would choose one person. And so in this period of time, that one person was a woman by the name of Deborah. And so Deborah was not only the prophet of Israel at the time, she was also the ruler of Israel. So she was a prophet and a judge at the same time. And she, oddly enough and interestingly enough, is the only person recorded in all the book of Judges that held both of those titles and both of those roles simultaneously. Usually you would have a prophet and a judge, and God said, Deborah, you're going to be both. So, Deborah, the prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah, which makes sense because that's her name. Between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came to her for judgment. She sent and summoned President Barack Obama. No, but that is who he's named after. Summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go gather your men at Mount Tabor? So, don't know if this is the first time she's telling him, or if maybe she had already told him at some point, and then he just didn't do it. But she gathers him, she calls him. He is the commander of all of the army of Israel, and she is his boss, because she's the judge, she's the prophet. So she calls him and says, hey, didn't God say, gather your men? Like, he's going to rescue us? And so the next verse, Barak said to her, if you will not go with me, or if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So she's like, listen, I'll go with you. I don't have a problem going with you. But when they tell this story, and they will, because God's going to create an amazing victory for Israel in this moment, you're not going to be the hero of the story. So just know that, and we're good. Chances are, I mean, not even chances are, like the fact Sisera and the Canaanites into Israel, regardless of whether Deborah went with him or not. But he's like, I don't want to do this without you. You're the judge. You're the prophet. If you don't come, I don't want to do it. And she's like, all right, great. I'm going to go. And someone else is going to get the glory for this victory. And it's not going to be you. It's going to be a woman. He's like, cool. No problem. He's super progressive. He's like, man, woman, who cares? Somebody kill Sisera and we're good. But here's the reality. If he had just said, I believe that God is going to win this victory. I believe that God is going to deliver the army of Canaan into our hands and we're going to win. But I don't want to go. I don't want to go onto the battlefield. I'm going to go home. I believe God. I just don't want to actually do anything about it. What would his actions prove about his belief? That he's a coward? Yeah, maybe. He's doubtful, exactly. His actions would actually undermine the things that he was saying, because faith requires action. You cannot say that you believe something and then act in a way that actually proves or shows the opposite to be true. So if you say, in this situation, for Barak, I believe that God is going to deliver the Canaanites. I believe that we are going to win, but I'm too scared to actually go and do it. What he would actually be saying is, I don't believe that God is going to win this victory. I don't believe that we are going to come out on top. I believe that I'm going to die if I go, and I don't want to die, so I'm not going to go. So he had enough faith to at least step out there. He was a little scared in the sense of like, I won't go unless you go. Maybe as like a, hey, are you sure? You're the prophet here. Are you sure that we're going to win? Because if you step out onto the battlefield and we don't win, you die also. So if you come, then I'm sure that God said this. If you don't come, maybe you're just making stuff up. She's like, I'll go with you. I don't have a problem with that. He's like, okay, good. Then let's go. Let's do this thing. And the same is true in our own lives. If you say that you believe in Jesus, if you say that you want to follow God, but then you constantly hedge your bets, you're like, yeah, but I also want to do all this stuff that God told me not to do. And, well, maybe it doesn't matter so much. Maybe God's not even there. Maybe. And you kind of just like want to do your own thing also. Then your actions are actually undermining what you say about what you believe. because faith requires that you actually put those beliefs into practice and step into action with them. So if there are areas in your life where you're kind of like, hey, I know this is what's true. I know this is what's right. I know this is what the Bible says and what God wants for me. I don't really want to do it. That's a dangerous place to be, because your actions and what you claim are going in two different directions. But sometimes, just like Barak here, you say, I want to do that. I want to believe that. I want to follow that. I just want to bring someone with me. And that's okay. Just like he did. He said, I want to go. I will go. But I want you to come with me because I don't think I can do it alone. There are times, even in my own life, even right now, that I'm like, hey, I can't do this thing that God's calling me to do unless I know that you're with me. My wife or a mentor or somebody that I trust and know, and I have them praying for me and I have them walking with me, and I go to them for advice and I say, hey, can you help me in this area of my life? There are going to be areas in your life, and especially areas of faith that God calls you into, that you're going to have to bring someone along with you, just like Barak brought Deborah. So let's pick up where we left off. Judges chapter 4, verse 13 says, Sisera called out all of his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots and all of his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and ran and fled away on foot. So who up to this point has gotten the glory for winning this victory? It's not Barak, even though he's the commander of the army. It's not even Deborah. It's the Lord, right? The Lord routed the army. So it had honestly nothing to do with Deborah, had nothing to do with Barak, but it required both of them to step out in faith and actually say, I'm going to follow what God is calling us to, because God did all the work. They just had to be faithful to follow what God was calling them into. And the same is true in our own life. God doesn't expect you to do things that only he can do. He expects you to trust him enough to step into those things so that you can watch him work. Judges 4, 17 through 21. But Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid. And he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. When you're exhausted and tired, but that's all she had, so that's what she gave him. And covered him, and he said to her, stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and says, is anyone here? Say, no. Great instructions. Okay, I got this awesome plan. Someone says, is anyone here? Here's what you say. No. Do you have it? Repeat it back to me so I know. But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and drove a hammer, and took a hammer in her hand, and then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was laying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. So he had a good plan worked out. Didn't quite work out that way for him. She did not say no. Instead, she said, tent peg to the temple. And so your temple is right here. So he's laying on his side, through one side, out the other side, and pretty much you can't survive that. In case you're like, and then what happened? so he died. Just in case anyone was like, okay, so then he just lived with a tent peg through his head for the rest of his life? No, he died. Forever, from this point forward, whenever this story of this battle of Israel is told, who got to win the victory? Not Barak, but Jael, the wife of Heber. And she did it because she picked a side. She was not an Israelite. She was not all automatically part of that side of this war. They actually lived in between the two territories, and they were kind of a neutral party, but she picked a side in that moment. And she said, I am going to not only pick a side and like, okay, we're going to partner with you. Like, she murdered the king's right-hand man of the Canaanites while he was sleeping with a tent peg. That's a pretty strong way to pick a side. But the same is true in our lives. That you can only live in the neutral territory for so long. There will come a time when somebody will say, hey, come do this thing with me. Everyone else is doing it. And you're going to go, man, I know that's not what God has for me. But they don't necessarily even know I'm a Christian because I'm not living as a Christian, or whatever the case may be. And you're going to have to pick a side. There's going to come a time when somebody will be talking a lot of trash about Christians or Christianity, and you're going to have to decide, am I going to out myself right now and stick up for God, or am I going to just like fade into the background and go, I wish she wasn't saying that, but I'm not going to do anything about it. There's going to come a time when someone in a class is going to be talking about, Jesus, or talking about the idea of God, and you're going to have to decide, am I going to remain neutral in this in-between ground, or am I going to make a stand here? The truth is, we have to pick a side every single day in a million different ways. Those are just some really obvious ways. But all day, every day, we're having to choose, am I going to do what the world says is normal? Or am I going to follow what God is calling me to? My hope is that, like Jael, you won't just kind of pick a side, but you'll say, I'm going to drive a tent peg through the head of what the world wants for me, and I'm going to strongly choose to follow Jesus. Obviously, just for clarification, do not actually drive a tent peg through any actual person's head ever. That is not what I'm advocating. This is not a squirrel. What? Why would you do that to a squirrel? If you were starving in the wilderness and you had to kill a squirrel to survive, absolutely. But if you're seeking out squirrels and murdering them, you're a psychotic murderer and probably going to end up in prison. Follow Jesus. God, thank you. Thank you for your word, even the hard and disturbing parts of it. And please help Dexter not to murder squirrels. Amen.
We did nail a snake.
Snakes are